All right. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Cultural Curriculum Chat podcast. I'm your host, Jebeh Edmunds, and this is where we explore the stories that engage, energize, and empower our listeners to lead with purpose, cultural awareness, and humanity. Today's guest has lived a life that reads like a novel, but every page is real. Ed Hajim, the son of a Syrian immigrant, is a seasoned Wall Street executive with more than 50 years of investment experience. He's served in senior leadership roles at E.F. Hutton, Lehman Brothers, Furman Cells, ING, MLH Capital, and eventually became chairman of the University of Rochester's Board of Trustees, where he has also made a transformational $30 million gift to support scholarships and engineering education. But long before that success came struggle. At just 3 years old, Ed was kidnapped by his father, told his mother had passed away, and spent his youth in foster care in orphanages. His memoir, On the Road Less Traveled, chronicles how he survived loneliness, poverty, trauma, and constant relocation, and still found the drive to pursue education, served in the military to fund his college experience, and ultimately built a life of meaning, leadership, and generosity. Ed is also the creator of The Island of the Four Ps, a life designed fable and curriculum grounded in four pillars: passion, principles, partners, and plans. A flexible, customizable framework that any school, organization, or individual can hold and build a more intentional and fulfilling life. Ed, welcome to the Cultural Curriculum Chat podcast. It is such an honor to have you here.
It's my privilege and my pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. So, your origin story is something that is like a survival of resilience and passion to keep going despite your circumstances that you've had. So, can you take us back to those early years going in that highly mobile environment of relocation?
Well, it's as you say, it reads like fiction.
Yeah.
I at 18 years old, when I left the second orphanage to go to college, I decided to bury my background. I was not going to tell anybody. I went to school. I told people we lived in a post office box in San Francisco. My mother died when I was 3, and that was it. I became quite a dark individual in that respect. Well, the girls kind of like that because when you're kind of dark, you're more interesting. But then when I got into my 70s, my wife and my 3 children started to put pressure on me, along with the University of Rochester. I gave my gift. I wanted to give it anonymously, but they said, no. In order to we have to know more about you. So I decided to start to write down the history, because when you write, you have to eventually combine what's fact and what you remember. And sometimes that's different. Luckily, I had saved all my letters from my father, and he had saved all the letters from me. In those days, people wrote letters. So I was able to get the facts squared away. And when I started to write it, I mean, I couldn't write the first draft because I'd buried it so long. My daughter, who was a writer, wrote the first draft for me. And then after, 3 or 4 years of talking about it, I was able to talk about it. But it was quite a story. I mean, my father, my first ghostwriter wanted me to hate my father. In writing the book, I recognized how difficult a situation he had. He lost everything. He was an immigrant. He came over, he had nothing. And by the 1929, like a lot of people, he had a lot of money, an airplane, he had buildings, he had a house, and he lost everything. So the demons never left him for the rest of his life. And you can't blame him for what he tried to do. And he loved me so much. When he got divorced and my mother got custody of me, he essentially got visiting rights and $5 a week of alimony and child support. He had visiting rights on Sunday, so he came to St. Louis, where she had taken me from Los Angeles for a living. And he basically, instead of taking me to the park or to a movie, got on back on Highway 66, which is on the front of the book, and drove me back to Los Angeles, told her not to look for us or else, and told me she died. And my publicist says, don't tell the story because you want people to buy the book. But, mother and I did, you'll find out what happened to my mother if you read the book. Or you can ask me a question and I'll tell you.
Oh,
But anyway,
no.
that started a trip of about 15 different places. hotel rooms, motel rooms. We had no relatives. So when Dad went to sea as a radio operator, that's where he was, in the merchant race. He'd leave me with neighbors or with friends and so forth. When the war broke out, he could no longer do that. So he put me in the Catholic welfare system, although we were Jewish. I mean, I didn't know I was Jewish. In fact, when I was 10 years old, I wrote my father for the baptismal papers because I was going to take my first communion. I was living with a Catholic family. I had 5 Catholic families during the war. And then I flew to New York, and Dad and I lived in the YMCA on 34th Street. As I remember, there were no Harvard graduate students there at all. It wasn't the best of places. But anyway, we ended up in a hotel in Coney Island. He looked for land-based work, couldn't get it, had to go back to sea. In the summer of 47, which is in the book, he put me with some neighbors, and the last minute she turned me down, so she couldn't take me. So I eventually spent part of that summer alone in a hotel room while he was at sea. And then in September, he was able to place me in an orphanage in Far Rockaway. And there I actually flourished. It was the first time in my life I had consistency and I had community. I had everything else was there were 5 different foster homes. I was always changing location. And here I spent 3 years in an orphanage with a very good public school. And in the public school, I flourished. But unfortunately, when I was 14, I aged out of that place. And my father totally disappeared completely, which I didn't find out why until 50 years later when I studied some papers that actually the governor of New York, he was basically in a court case and he just abandoned me, basically. So I became a ward of the state, was placed in a second orphanage, luckily in an orphanage, because you could have gone to God knows what. Those days, boys were sent to all kinds of places. But anyway, I got to a second orphanage, and instead of having 50 kids in a room, we only had 3. And that was a pretty good deal. And the local high school was superb. And I actually got an epiphany that I saw my way out of this thing, because 80% of the kids in this particular high school went to something called a private college. And as my sophomore year, I said, that's what I have to do. And the kids at the orphanage said, most of us don't do that. They don't make it. But that's what I decided to do. And luckily, I got a scholarship, not an NROTC scholarship. So I've devoted my life to scholarships. I've got, I've given scholarships to 10 or so institutions. At the University of Rochester, I have, a number of kids that do it. At my golf club, we give 25 scholarships a year. So, and down here in Key Largo, I have a scholarship program with the local college. Because I think that's essentially what my second book was all about. It's that period of time between 17 and 19, or that transition people make, what I had to make when I was 18, where a little bit of funds, a little bit of money can take you over the top, can take you on to the next step. And if you don't get that funding, then you end up taking a different path. And so that's where I've sort of dedicated my philanthropy to. And I probably have now 200 or 300, I suppose, maybe scholars over time at 10 different institutions. So that's been the thought process. And I've been very lucky. I was born at the right time. I married the right woman, which is very important. We just celebrated our 60th.
Oh, congratulations. What a blessing. 60 years.
I was making a talk at Sacred Heart University the other day. And afterwards, when a young man came up and says, how did it last so long? I just stayed married so long. I said, one word. He said, what was that? I said, listen.
Listen, yes. Hey, that's a new book for you right there, Ed. Yes.
You're right. Now I'm writing another third book, and one of the chapters is going to be listen.
Listen. Oh, I love that. Oh, and just to think the circumstances you were dealt with, how you turned that into life-changing decisions for your life. And again, in turn, change the life of 20 to, 100 scholars that have benefited from your philanthropy. That just goes to say that determination and that drive that you had instilled in you. And like you said, too, with community around you and that consistency, you can't do this work alone. And how you found that, is so powerful, Ed. Wow.
But I also wanted to say that, the disadvantages, the difficulties I went through ended up in later life. Some of them, anyway, ended up as advantages. When you go from one schoolyard to the next, you develop an ability to adapt. You gain something called adaptability, which lasts your whole life, essentially. The resilience that I had to have and did have lasted my whole life. The perseverance, and after a while, you go through these difficulties. There's a little person on your shoulder saying, You can do it. So when the difficult times come again, like when I got to college, I was wearing a black leather jacket. I didn't look the part. I didn't have the social graces. I got rejected by all the fraternities. I could have just cashed in and left. But little person on my shoulder said, Ed, you can do it. You've been, and by the way, the food at school was a little better than the food at the orphanage. There's I got 3 or 4 roommates. I had one. So it was a better deal. And then
Yeah, I
went on.
love
And
that.
of course, college was a chance where I made a complete transition. I became a different person, essentially. And that's why education is my second mantra, which is education is the solution to everything. You know,
Yes.
it really is.
It really is. And I just love how you said the ages 17 to 19 is such that pivotal transitional period for all of us, trying to figure things out on their own. And you had the courage because of your circumstances and being on your own and not having that semblance of community, but you still felt that love of your father to try to do the best that he could. And I love that when you shared that part of your story of people were telling you to be negative about your parents, but you took it as a way of this is what they were dealt with and they did the best that they could. And a lot of trauma survivors are still trying to figure that out. So thank you so much for sharing that part of your story that they both had their own struggles in trying to figure things out and the circumstances with the war and being an immigrant, it wasn't an easy card that they were dealt with. It was
And he
just
gave me
how you had to
the
do it.
love. He just, in every letter that he ever wrote, he
Yes.
said, "You're the greatest." And, so I sort of believed it.
Yes, of course. Of course. Oh, I love that. So, with your lived experience and you talking about your journey, and pushing yourself towards education and earning your degree from the University of Rochester, you also did that by going into the ROTC program. So, can you share with us, besides that little voice on your shoulder, who else helped you move forward academically to keep going without that safety net? Because I remember you said you had that little bit of push, that little bit of scholarship,
Oh,
you know?
I think everybody, I mean, for a while, I wouldn't take anybody's advice because I didn't trust people. But it was a big,
Yeah.
huge mistake on my part. But as I look back, and again, that's why writing a book is so important. I look back, there were a lot of mentors along the way. I mean, the head of the orphanage, second orphanage in Yonkers, New York, a man named Ruben Kafta. Although I had trouble taking his advice, he was always behind me. He basically said, you can go ahead, you can go to college, you can go to prep. When I finally got the NRTC scholarship, he added a little bit of money to it because the scholarship basically didn't pay for everything. Only paid $50 a month. And I didn't have any. I worked at a grocery store and I was a bin setter and so forth, but I had saved all of $200 by working after school because those days you didn't get paid very much. So he had given me a couple $100 scholarship, which again helped me. So then my freshman year, I had a lot of trouble with mechanical drawing. I just was not good at it. And the professor there helped me through that. And he mentored me all through my 4 years. We became real partners because he got me through that. We got to know each other. Then I started to do much better at other courses. So there was another mentor. But all my life, I've tried to find people who've been there, done that before me. In fact, here I am, a very sophisticated Wall Street executive, CEO of a brokerage investment bank. But I had Wally, who was about 10 years older than I was, who had done a lot of the things that I'd done. He was a senior officer for one of the major brokerage firms. And Wally was a fantastic character. He was the head of the Hudson Institute. He was just a wonderful man. I've known him all my life. When I had a question, I would call Wally and say, "Wally, what do you think?" In a normal case, he was able to either listen to me or help me through. So I think everybody should be, and this has been established now in high schools and colleges. I'm involved in a group called Wiley in Boston that basically they have they have 10 counselors, and each counselor has 8 or 10 kids in the Boston area, MIT, Tufts, and so forth. These kids have to talk to their counselor once a week because kids don't flunk out academically in many respects. They flunk out socially.
Yes.
They get behind and then they fade out. So these are groups are all over the country. And I look back at my life and mentoring was very important. Now, it was in pieces. I didn't have a mentor all the way through, like someone, if you have your father or you have a priest or a rabbi or somebody who takes you through your whole life. But I had different pieces, This fellow at the orphanage, the fellow at college, one of my commanding officers in the Navy, when I applied to the Harvard Business School, which one of my friends was forcing me to do, I said, I have no money and I have no grades. My grades were not terrific in college. And he said, you got to come here. So I asked one of my commanding officers to write a recommendation letter for me, and he must have mistaken me for somebody else. But he wrote one of these great letters, and I got in, which was shocking. So that was, again, he was a mentor when I was in the service, and the service changed my life again, which I highly recommend. If I had the magic wand, I'd make every young person spend 2 or 3 years doing something else besides, either work or school. I think the service was a real change for me, and I can spend, hours talking about what happened with to a 22-year-old reports aboard a ship. And the captain says, "Here is your division, 80 men, ages 18 to 55, having 150 eyeballs look at you every morning. It makes you a changed person after a while." So
Totally.
there's great the discipline I learned in the Navy, the responsibility I got in the Navy, the experience I got in the Navy. It was just, unbelievable, wonderful. I almost stayed 3 years there, but I'd beaten my brains out to get this engineering degree, and I figured I might as well figure that would. So I decided to leave and become an engineer. That was my first step. But anyway, long answer, short question. Sorry.
I love it. No, no, I could listen to you all day, Ed. Oh my goodness. But you're right. Mentorship is so important. Shout out to my mentor, Dr. Joki Kamal at University of Minnesota Duluth and Dr. Deborah Peterson Perlman at University of Minnesota Duluth. Those women kept me, in that social, you've got this, the encouragement. And I was also struggling on campus as an immigrant, still waiting to get my permanent residency. And they really walked me through and helped me go through those struggles, that a lot of kids on campus didn't relate to. So I really appreciate you sharing that, Ed. And then again, knowing that there are programs still around on these institutions for students to go and work with their counselors once a week. That's pivotal because you're right. It's not just academically that students fade out, it's that social nurturing and that motivation and encouragement our students need.
Well, this
Yeah.
group was, when COVID came, these kids had no place to go. So this group basically placed them in all places all around Boston. They didn't have a home to go to. But but also they need a little bit of money for cosmetics or a bit of money to take a short trip. This group takes care of that. The woman who started as an angel, started with 5 kids. She has now 75, and they're on her way to 200. Because what they do is they go to the financial department of these universities, saying, "Have you got someone who's got a scholarship that needs counseling?" And they sign a deal. And once a student signs up is a requirement, they become actually now it's kind of an alumni association now. They have
Love
been doing
that.
it for about 20 years. So it's a
Oh,
really fat one, but there are organizations like that. And today you can't get help. But in my day, you couldn't. In fact, if you tried to get help, you were kind of ostracized outside. People who got help were flooding. So
yeah.
you had to bury all that in your own thing. And I don't know whether that's good or bad, but it's just that was the responsibility. But as I didn't relate to a lot of the other kids because what they talked about, I didn't experience.
Yeah.
Just like
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
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 Yeah, no, yeah, the different lived experience, it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's hard to relate going
Yeah.
to the immigration office before class. It's like,
Yeah.
what? Yes.
They didn't have to do that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Oh, I want to talk more about your book, The Island of the Four Ps. I love how it's simple, but yet very powerful. Passion, what drives you, your principles, what grounds you, your partners who support you, and your plans. Where are you going? Can you give us that overview of the four Ps? Just a little taste, because I want folks, my listeners, to purchase this book because it's a great framework.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but all my life I've learned an enormous amount from fables because they aren't preachy, they're not teachy. And also in a fable, it traps you into doing your own thinking. And
Yes.
what I want to do, this young man arrives on an island, and there's a young woman later on in the story. Basically, just like every person who leaves home to go to college or take the first job. And for the first time in your life, you actually can decide who you are. In other words, you really are a combination of your genes and your environment. You have no control over any of those. So you have no control over who you are. But when you get off that boat and land on that island or arrive at that college, for the first time, you can say to yourself, here's who I am. Here are the things about me that I want to keep. Here's the things about me I might want to decrease or even eliminate. And here's the things maybe over the next 4 or 5 years I want to add. But that's the first time you've been allowed to make that decision. And that's why the book with he gets off the boat, the navigator and the captain, which is mother and dad or friends, whatever else. He's now alone for the first time, and he meets this older man who's not a teacher. He's a guide. He's guiding him through passions, principles, partners, and plans. Now, what I've tried to do here is, and you can add some words if you want to, I wanted a simple vocabulary which you can continue to go back to. And where did I get that vocabulary? When I made decisions as a young man and later on in life, I had these yellow pads I would write down. And when I looked at those yellow pads, I kept seeing those words: passion, principles, partners, and plans. And so I brought them out. And I really wanted something where it'd be simple. Someone can talk to their inner voice, which makes all your decisions, and the vocabulary with the inner voice is consistent. It's not a whole bunch of, words running around. These are 4 words we're going to go back to. Your passions over time will change. Your principles, you will add some of your principles. You even subtract some of your principles. I get a kick out of this. And when I was on Wall Street, I had a very strong principle: to live happy was to live hidden. No publicity, no magazines. I was going to run the company. I was a CEO, a managing partner. I was going to run the company. That's where I was going to spend my time. If I had extra time, I'd go home and have dinner with my family. But I was not going to become a public persona. Now that I'm writing books and want to sell ideas, I'm on social media. I'm doing all this stuff. So I had to abandon that principle. And, and people say to me, what's your most important principle today? And it's very simple. It's gratitude. So, and gratitude, when I was a young man, I wasn't grateful. I was angry. But now over time, you've added this principle to it. So in many respects, that's important. And partners are key. I mean, it's just, in fact, partners can almost be the first. If you get partners right, sometimes it makes you married a guy from Minnesota. That's sweet. A Scandinavian guy, it's all.
Yep. Partner for 20 years. Yeah, you get it. You know it. Yeah.
My best thing is say, I said, I love her more than yesterday and less than tomorrow. And I always kid about it. Sometimes she says, you skip a few days. But, finding the right partner who's going to support you and who you can share your life with is part of the ballgame. But also, I found in work and in philanthropic areas, finding someone who could do things you can't do, find someone who can do things better than you can do them. Now, what I found, which is really secret, is find a person who does things you do well that you don't want to do. You get that, those 3 things, you've got partners. And I actually in business found a 6'5" Dartmouth graduate who's still a good friend of 35 years together. He did all those. He did things better than I could do. He did things I didn't want to do, and he basically took care of everything. So when I was the CEO of an investment bank and someone from the government came in, I didn't meet with him. He met with him. If there was an HR problem, he did IT problem, he handled it. I spent my time hiring people, building businesses, and stimulating and inspiring people. He was as a CEO, but he did all that other wonderful stuff. And he was my partner for 35 years. The same thing, I think, that almost in everything you do, you find a right partner who can do the kind of things that allow you to be successful. So partners, and then my mind, writing plans down. I find if you write something down, it's your thinking is fuzzy, talking is even fuzzier. Write something down and look at it and say, is this what I really want to do? And then let's give it a try. And again, when you say you want to do something, the word doesn't translate to what's happening. I kid about this, but I wanted to be a physicist in my sophomore year. So I took an advanced physics course, and I looked around at the people in the room and I said, these people are not my people. They're much more serious than I am. They're not as oriented as I am toward more activities and so on. So I got out of that. So the key to it, in my mind, is and even when I got in the Navy, I put out 40 resumes because I really wanted to work in San Francisco because I had a girlfriend there, but I couldn't I got 2 job offers, one in Wilmington, Delaware, and one in Lexington, Kentucky. Lexington, Kentucky was in a plant. I was going to be an assistant plant manager. And in Wilmington, I was going to be an applications research engineer. Both of them were called engineers, but they were totally different jobs. So when you write down what you want to be, where you want to go, you got to make sure those names, those monikers, tell you what you're going to do Monday morning. And same thing to business school. I mean, when I got out of business school, the different being an investment banker and being an analyst. They were just names. In those days, in my mind, I turned out to be an analyst. Well, investment banker was an eagle. The analyst was a gopher. On the other hand, investment banker spent 4 years in a dungeon following somebody around. An analyst in those days was out on the road in 3 months. So these are the monikers you got to be very careful. So that's what the book is all about. And I want people to read it, but when they read it, be trapped into doing their own thinking about each one of these different things and recognizing there's a progression in passions,
Mm.
principles, partners, and in plans. You got to keep writing these things. Now, these kids who are going to live to 100, we're going to have to pivot a number of times. So
Oh,
this
yes.
particular process is going to be very important. You're going to get to some place where what you're doing is going to be obsolete. You better move pretty quickly into the next thing. Or like me, comes to the end of your business career and you're going to pivot into something else. I've developed a series of principles for this particular experience, which is different than what I was doing when I was operating as an Wall Street person.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that
And
it?
I just
That stuff?
oh, it's I love it. Again, this is a guide that young people honestly, I have a senior in high school, my oldest son. I'm getting him this book to, for his next chapter in life because it is a guide. I love how you say it is simple that you can go back to it and also that progression because you are going to pivot. I pivoted. I was a classroom teacher for 20 years and I pivoted to be my own CEO of my own education company
You know,
5 years ago. So it is, and I just wrote my first novel as well. So it's like the progression of how you have your yellow book of notes of where you see yourself going, but you can also erase a couple things and let things go. I love that when you talk about that metaphor on the island, that there's some things you just have to decrease and let things go and learn from this guide of how you stand in your own way, from
because you're unique. You're unique. You have to
you are
find out who you
unique.
are and what you want
Yeah.
to do and can do.
Yes, what you want to do and can do. And that also brings to, designing your life mean to someone who comes from struggle and who feels stuck. And I think you did touch on that about, having that trust in yourself, finding the right partners for you, and then also recognizing who are not your people and making that pivot to move on, not to stay stuck and to go, well, it is what it is. I picked this major. I don't want to disappoint my family
Yeah.
because I picked this. It's always that pivot in that belief in yourself, to make that choice for you. Oh, man, Ed.
And I pitch kids
Yeah.
like mine with foster kids that I give lectures to. I said, "You're lucky," and they all say, "What do you mean we're lucky? We're in these foster homes." I said, "Because you now are overcoming difficulties. You have advantages over your peers in a sense. If you've gone through difficulties already, you'll have less anxiety. When you go up to a problem, you'll say, "Well, I've faced that before." Because kids like my children grew up in a fancy neighborhood, they didn't face those kinds of problems.
No,
Yeah, that's very important.
it is. And I feel that too with that struggle in learning on your own and how to switch things up and survive and change and to think of different ways of how A could be to B to C, And you're right, our kids too, their generation is their expectation of, oh, you know, my son was like, "I left the dome light on in my truck." I'm like, "Well, see if you can find a jump, with somebody in the neighbor, I'm like, "It's okay. You'll be fine." And he's thinking the sky is falling. It's like, "It's okay." Think and talking him through. And again, you're right. This younger generation who's grown up with their circumstances to say, "Oh, you already figured this part out." There's kids now that are your age that are starting to learn how to figure things out, and their struggle is tough too, and again, as a parent, like, dang, I should have like made the dome light for you earlier.
Well, basically, this generation, unfortunately, has quite been separated from war and depression and things like that.
Yes,
And so,
yes,
Maslow's needs food, shelter, security, and so forth, they don't feel that at all. So,
yes, that's true.
you don't expect if you have that, it's sort of you have a different mentality. And I think that's been one of the mistakes we make here. Is
Yeah,
and it's nothing you can do. You try to do the best for your kids, and sometimes it's not the best for them. But that's
yeah,
what I say: send your kids to Outward Bound, send them to
yes,
schools, have them work, and
yeah,
most important thing is get them out there where they're uncomfortable as early as possible,
yes,
so they can
I
become
love that.
comfortable with difficult circumstances. And because life's not the road of life is always under construction. I mean, there's always some bump coming up that you're going to get someplace.
Yes, always, always. Oh my gosh, I love that. And speaking of road, let's talk about your road less travel and how powerful it is. What advice do you have for leaders who struggle to let go? Especially when change does feel risky. I love how you shared about your own life of, being on Wall Street and doing the things and not, and being in the background, then all of a sudden having to change to be on social media as an author, like, yeah, give us a little bit of advice of for
Well,
those who struggle to let go of what they're
I have
used to. Mhm.
I have three mantras. One is constantly tell yourself that anything is possible.
Yes.
That's a little bit of a cliche, but I think that's what you have to keep saying that to yourself. The second thing is that education is the solution to everything. And I think these young people, someplace in their life, might have to go back to school full time, given the changes that occur. The third thing, which I mean, really has solved problems for me, is never be a victim. Using the energy to be a victim, take that energy, and the title of my next book is called What's Next. Focus your energy on what's next. What's next are two magic words because that's where that's hard enough. If you use up your energy hating someone, blaming someone, worrying about someone, you're going to not have that energy to figure out what's next for you. And that's what's next is all that really counts. So never be a victim is my third mantra. And then there's the 8 words, which I have: passions, principles, partners, plans. And then the 4 parts of life: self, family, work, and community. Community is a word of giving back. So you integrate those 8 words and you basically come up with almost every situation you could think of. And, and again, the 4 realms of life, you spend a lot more time on self when you're younger, then you work your way into family and work, and eventually you get to community. And it's not a balance because by definition, you're always out of balance. If you're working very hard, you're basically neglecting some of the other parts. You know, if your family has a crisis, you'll spend less time on work. So it's not a balance; it's a harmony between you move back and forth and be concentrated. You know, and if you're going into a difficult situation like I was when I went to Lehman Brothers as a partner, I called the family together and said, "The next couple of years, I'm going to work much harder. You're going to see less of me. I recognize that it's not my fault, but something that's good for the family." And then, of course, later on in life, if you have more time, as I do now, for community, you can give back. And it is a very important part of everybody's life because there is no greater satisfaction than when you do something for somebody else. And you know what?
Yes.
My predecessor, the road less travel, not on the road less travel, Scott Peck said, giving back is love. And you've learned this all year through your life. If you learn to give back at the end of your life, then you basically have satisfied what I consider to be the so-called success requirement. So, but
Oh, yeah.
that's what I try to give. But those 3 mantras: anything's possible, education is the solution, and never be a victim, seem to work pretty well as messages. And they're in the. And by the way, I have examples of those. I mean, and early in my life, I was the CEO of a small company. I made a mess out of it. It was my fault, but I didn't focus on it. Once I sold it back, I went on to the next level, next thing, and it worked out. Later on in life, I did everything right at Lehman Brothers, and they still pushed me out. But instead of suing them and going to the press, I got focused on what's next. And I found my dream job. So I have examples of each one of these experiences. This is not just theoretical. This is real. And that's what I'm excited about. As I started to write this book and both books and the next book, basically, I figured there were things that I could help people with, get over some of the early bumps. That's all I'm hoping to do, is to get people to think a little more. And by the way, the old cliche, if you save one life, that makes it worthwhile. And I think I've got letters from mothers. One of my friends, one of my mothers wrote me. She said, "My daughter didn't know what to do. She read your book. Now she's a freshman at Notre Dame." So, what do I need that? I don't need anything more than that.
That. Oh, yes, and you've done well. Yes. Oh my goodness, Ed. I could listen to you all day with your pearls of wisdom and your
Oh,
stories and your humor. Oh my gosh, your humor. I love it. I just have to share that this has been a very important conversation. And thank you again for being on the show. And listeners and audience, I will have where you can find Ed's books. And again, that's going to be my son's graduation present. The Island of the Four Ps. It's a great guide. I'm excited to have him read your book and get on to the next part of his road and his journey and help support him on the bumps along the way. So thank you for tuning in. And Ed, where can our listeners find you?
Well, yeah, lucky unfortunately it's Hajim rather than Hajim. Hajim
Oh,
sounds
I'm so sorry.
much
Hajim.
better, but it's Hajim. We anglicized it. It's a wonderful name because there aren't any names like that. So you just put my name into Amazon, you get my two books. But www.edhajim gives you a pretty robust website which lays out everything, which is actually being improved now because it's going to add my curriculum for my life design course, which I'm now without teaching in 8 different institutions. So I'm very happy about that. It's starting to spread because my last crusade here is the added dimension, which is very presumptuous on my part, very presumptuous. Added
Oh,
dimension
you
of
can do
college
it.
education, where the school actually focuses on the individual, and this student takes a life design course and graduates with a diploma and a life design, which is written in pencil, just like you said. So you got to be able to erase it and change it. But you get those two
Yes.
things rather than the one thing. And when the kid goes home at Christmas time, he says to his parents, they're not only interested in teaching me stuff, they're also interested in me as an individual. Anyway.
In this life journey. Oh, I love it, Ed Hajim. I'm so sorry for the
Oh,
mispronunciation.
no, that's why I have a school
Yes.
in Rochester named after me. So kids got to pronounce my name correctly.
You know it. Well, that's my goal. Then I'll have to manifest and work on that. Have a Jebeh building at my alma mater too. I love that. Oh, well, thank you so much for this inspirational conversation. And if this episode inspired you, listeners, please follow and share this episode of the Culture Curriculum Chat podcast. And as always, visit jebehedmunds.com for more multicultural educational lessons and resources and purchasing my new book, the debut novel, The Orange Blossom. Until next time, keep learning, keep listening, and keep creating spaces where every story matters. Thanks again. Bye-bye.